wrapping up here, let's talk about when we have completed our testing. You know, we've talked about how testing has all these different things possible. We've talked about all these different things. We have to worry about security and all the different boundary values and the loops and it can get really, really big. Testing, the more complex code gets, the more complex your test can get. And you can keep expanding your testing exponentially to be able to test every combination of things that happen. But do I need to test every single option at every single phase, at every single data input? You know, and then do I need to retest those anytime anything changes? And what happens if I integrate new pieces of the system? Do I have to go through and test all that stuff all over again, every option? I mean, believe me, I've worked with testing groups that they take their job seriously and they really don't want failures to happen. And so they start with this attitude of, oh, well, you changed the configuration file. We got to go retest everything. And I'm like, well, you didn't test properly beforehand if you didn't test change the configuration, because that's a data option. But yeah, I mean, we could do some basic testing. We have to retest everything. And there's other cases I support them. Like, hey, this is a fundamental thing. I need to make sure everything still works. I'll give you an example. I once had a system that we changed the username password to a database in configuration. Believe it or not, going back 15, 20 years ago, if you had an internal system, you set the password, you might keep that same password for years on end because nobody knew about it. I mean, there's 2 or 3 people who knew it in the whole company. And then when hackers started getting inside systems and networks, then you got it where the password would change every 90 days or every 45 days, or I've actually seen even more crazy systems around that. And so I once had a tester saying, well, if you're testing the password, we need to test all these functions all over again. I'm like, dude, if the username password in the database doesn't work, nothing will work or everything will work. It's not selective. There's the same username password everywhere. So it's about understanding, because analysis, as my slide says here, is the key. Understanding the system, how the design works, how the requirements are working. I want to know what changes can really impact the system in which ways. I need to trust my experts when they tell me how the system's built, and then validate that what they said is true one time, and then let it go from there. Sometimes you can spend so much money making sure everything works that your software's expensive and late and slow to arrive and reduces value to the business. I've actually seen companies start to internally implode because their IT, well, what happens is the business beats up IT for every little mistake. The IT becomes more and more protective about not making mistakes, and so projects become more expensive and more slow to deliver, and there's more pushback anytime something is outside the ordinary. And then what ends up happening is the business says you're too expensive to do stuff with, and they start scaling back how much software they do, or they start finding contractors externally to do it with, and they become less agile as a business, and other people start to catch up, and the whole thing starts to crumble. There has to be a nice coordination between the IT workers and the business workers to understand what appropriate risks are, to understand how we can quote unquote cut corners appropriately, yet still ensure software meets the basic needs and doesn't put our user data or functionality at risk. And that's where a good design and a good test plan help. The more we can consider how to test a system when we design it, the better. If we don't build designs that become really, really hard to test, then we can have our testing be more affordable. And so what's the hard test? Well, if my system's very bound together, if there's a lot of technical debt inside of it, and we have very tight interfaces, then it can be very hard to test things independently. If I can keep things independent, then when changes happen, I can say, well, that's definitely limited to this system because this is the only place in the whole system where this part is calculated. So that's an example of being able to keep your testing focused and by a better design. And so your job now is going to be to take these concepts and start to apply them into a test plan. And my challenge to you as you rate requirements this week, and you think about designs that would be put inside of there, is to think about how testing should influence and update your requirements and designs as you go, as well as how you're learning these testing concepts.